Hello and blessings to everyone today. I'm John Pritchett, team teacher with the Duo Douglas class at First Baptist Church of Pell City, Alabama. We're so happy you've joined us today. Our lesson title is Song of Songs from the Song of Solomon, of course, chapters 2 and 3. I want to read a little poem for you before we get into our lesson today. Collards is green, my dog's name is Blue. I'm so lucky to have a sweet thing like you. Your hair is like corn silk a-flapping in the breeze, softer than blues, and without all them fleas. You move like the bass, which excites me in May. You ain't got no scales, but I love you anyway. You're as sassy as okra flying in the pan. You're as fragrant as snuff right out of the can. You have some of your teeth for which I am proud. I hold my head high when you're in a crowd. On special occasion when you shave under your arms, while I'm in hog heaven and awed by your charm. Some men get roses for that special day of Valentine's from the cooler at Bilo's. That's impressive, I say. Some men buy diamonds from flea market's booth. Diamonds are forever, they explain, suave and couth. But for this man, honey, don't do those things, 'cause you're so special, you sweet thing, you. I got a gift without taste nor odor, more useful than diamonds. It's a new trolling motor. Well, as we think of poems today, many of us men particularly are romantically challenged, and today we're going to look at a psalm by Solomon, and it's actually entitled several different ways: the Song of Solomon, the Song of Songs, or some in Hebrew it says it's the best song. It was one of Solomon's finest songs. Solomon wrote over 105 songs, not just poems, but out of all of these 1,000, he said this is his best. In other words, it was the #1 song of the Jerusalem hit parade back in the year 1000 BC. In the New Testament and the Old Testament, it's part of Old Testament poetry, where we have Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and then the Song of Songs. It's a book that is a love song, and it clearly illustrates and celebrates the joy of physical, intimate love within marriage. And that's one of the distinctive messages, that sex is God's gift, his good gift, and it should be enjoyed. It's a message that all married couples need to hear, and also those anticipating marriage. There's a unique thing about this, though, is it has no theological statement, so to speak. It has no fresh revelations. It has no divine law in it. And it seems like it has nothing to say about our personal relationship with the Lord. Now, there's been great debate over this book on its focus, on how it should be interpreted. Many Christians, and particularly our Jewish friends, see this as a love story between the Lord and his people. It's still read today at the Jewish Passover, and it reminds the Jewish nation, the Israelites, of their time from slavery and how much God loved them to redeem them with all their hearts, their soul, and abilities. And that is not a bad interpretation, and we do interpret it in the sense of it is a relationship between man and woman, but we also understand the relationship between God and man. But there is no doubt it's a great lyric love poem, and it's designed for us to understand intimate relationships before marriage and during marriage. It also, as I mentioned, emphasizes again Ephesians chapter 5, where we looked last week about Christ being the head of the church. Because of these uncertainties of interpretation, and because of some of the sensual passages in here, many times this book is ignored. I would hasten to say it's probably been a while since you've read this book, and we certainly don't hear it preached much from the pulpit, and we hear it very seldom talked about in class. And so it is a book that we sometimes neglect. The book has 5 different speakers, and as I say, it is a song. It was sung, a song, a poem slash. There are 5 speakers: the man, which is Solomon; there's the woman, the Shulamite; and then there's the young women of Jerusalem who are unmarried, young women. There's a narrator, and then there's the Shulamite's brothers. So let me give a brief overview of how we're going to look. There's only 8 chapters, and we're going to look at the first 3 or 4 today, and then we'll conclude our study next week. But King Solomon lived in the 10th century BC. He became king of Israel after his father David passed away, and he was only 15 years old. He was the wisest of all kings, and he had many vineyards outside of Jerusalem and in the nation. And as he was traveling one day to the northern part of his kingdom, of Galilee, so to speak, he came across this young lady that was working in the vineyards. And her name is not really given. We call her the Shulamite. And she was probably a country girl. And in her introduction to Solomon, she says, "Pay no attention to my dark skin, because I've been working out in the sun, because my brothers oversee me and they make sure that I work hard." And so she was dark complected, a little different from today, where many women want to be dark complected, but in Solomon's time, to be fair complected was a wonderful thing for them. But the story goes on that they fell in love, and he would come back and forth, and he would visit with her, and he finally asked her to marry him. Now, we don't know exactly how old he was at this time, but as I said, he was 15 when he became king. He was still a very young man, and this young lady was probably about the same age, about 14 or 15, as we'll look in chapter 8, and we can see how she is described age-wise and again physically in there. And so we see the first half of the book is their courtship, their introduction, their courtship, and we'll end right before the marriage today. The next week we'll pick up from the marriage on into the difficulties of the marriage itself. As we look at verse 15 in chapter 2, we're going to see a familiar phrase here that, again, we might have memorized, and we at least have read. Throughout this book, you're going to see several passages that you can probably quote or have heard, but you just may not realize exactly what book they were from. Now, in this particular passage, it says the women of Jerusalem are speaking. This is a group of unmarried ladies, probably about her age, and friends of Shulamite, as we'll say. It says, "Catch the foxes for us, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards, for our vineyards are in full bloom." So we can see from this setting here that it's springtime. Solomon and Shulamite probably have been walking. They've been seeing each other now for a while. They're walking through the vineyards, through the gardens, through the woods, and the subject comes up about the little foxes that invade the vineyards. Well, we understand that a vineyard is say, for instance, the grape vineyard, where the grapes would grow on the ground, because they didn't have the trellises back in Solomon times that we have now that elevate the fruit off the ground. So most of these vines were just growing in the little foxes. They were only about 16 inches high, maybe 20 pounds in weight. They had little short legs, and they would come in and they would destroy these vineyards. Now, again, we're going to see a lot of symbolism and figure of speech in here. So the little red fox is a figure of speech for little compromises that come our way, little issues that come up. And what the women of Jerusalem are saying here is, catch those little foxes, those little things that come our way that will destroy and ruin the vineyard. Well, what is the vineyard? It's basically here saying it's connected to the bride and her personal background. It refers to her relationships. It refers to her body. It refers to her physical appearance. So it says, our vineyards are in full bloom. And so she and Solomon are at that stage, that wonderful stage of courtship, and they're budding their relationship, so to speak. It's in full bloom. And he says, we don't want these things to destroy that. So here we're seeing that these little foxes have to be dealt with, the little issues that will attack our marriage. And also, as we think of it in another sense, the little issues, the little foxes that can destroy our relationship with the Lord. Think in terms of the marriage a second. Time apart many times hurts a marriage. Escalation of little issues. It's your fault. It's your fault. These little things will escalate. Sometimes we think in terms of retreating. Sometimes we think that's the best course that we have in a relationship, where we just retreat and we choose not to discuss it. But what that really says is, I'm not really interested in what you have to say. So we have to be very careful that these little foxes, these little things that come into all of our lives, not only in our marriage, but in society itself, with friendships, with church. Again, we're talking about marriage in this lesson. These little things can come in and ruin the vineyard. Now in verse 16, here's another very familiar passage of Scripture. It says, "My love is mine, and I am his. He feeds among the lilies." Now in this particular verse, the woman, Shulamite, is speaking. And it just presents just a little snapshot of her love in marriage and her expression of mutual submission, okay? Now, this verse doesn't give a lot of background to how you are submissive. It just says, "My beloved is mine and I am his." Colossians goes on to tell us that a Christ-centered marriage is built on mutual submission. And then again in Ephesians chapter 5, we see where Paul talks about the woman submitting to her husband, and then the husband also giving up some personal preferences in favor of what is best for his wife. And so it's a mutual situation here. It says, "My beloved is mine and I am his. He grazes or feeds among the lilies." Now, this is an interesting verse here. Earlier in chapter 2, verse 1, the woman has described herself as the rose of Sharon and a lily of the valley. Solomon quickly says, "You may be the lily of the valley among thorns." In other words, he's building her up, giving her a compliment here. One aside here that we see, you've heard the song, "The Lily of the Valley," and it's used in a relationship of our Lord Jesus Christ and man. But that comes from this passage here. And also another gospel hymn that came out of the 1800s. Both of these were doing those revival years of the late 1800s. "I am his and he is mine." Again, this reinforces the thought of mutual submission. And so we think in terms of we have to be appreciative of each other. Earlier in the Scriptures too, she describes Solomon as an apple tree. Well, we may think that's a little humorous, because an apple tree is a wonderful tree. It has wonderful fruit. It's not the largest tree. It's not a cedar. It's not an oak. But it has delicious fruit. And many of these other trees may be cut down for other things, but you would very seldom cut down the apple tree. So comparing a beloved one, a loved one, is a matter of perspective. It's the attitude that you have when viewing each other. And it says here that he grazes among the lilies. Now, he is a king, although she did not realize that when they first met. She just thought he was a landowner. But later, when he takes her to the banqueting table, which we know there's another song based off of that as well, it tells us that Solomon, as we know, was around many, many women through his life. And he had over 700 wives and 300 concubines over the period. But here he's in his young days, and of all the women that he was around, he says that she is the finest. And so they're building trust in their relationships, in their courtships, in this way. Now verse 7, we're going to go on. It says, "Until the day breaks," and this is the women speaking, this is the woman, Shulamite, "until the day breaks and the shadows flee, turn around, my love, and be like a gazelle or a young stag on the divided mountain." Well, we may think that the daybreak would be the morning time, but in the context here, it's saying when the day breaks, or the coolest part of the day, So it's saying that it's an evening time. They're again strolling. It says shadows flee at night. And then she turns around to Solomon as they're walking. She says, come to her. And this describes an intimate desire on her part and his as well that's often expressed before marriage. She uses the figure, as we do through all of this, of different animals. He talks about the gazelle, which is a small animal that's swift. It resembles the antelope, and of course a stag is a male deer. It represents his vigor and potency. And then at the end it talks about the divided mountains, which is obviously a description of her enticing physical features as well. But she acknowledges here that she has a strong desire for her fiancé, which is a God-given desire, but she wants to remain pure until the wedding night. And as we look over in the latter part of this study, we're going to see that that's exactly what happened, that she was pure for that wedding night. Now, we move to chapter 3. This has just been the initial courtships. Now they're coming up close to the wedding day. And she is, in verse 1 of chapter 2, it says, in my bed, this is the woman speaking, in my bed at night, I sought the one I love. I sought him, but did not find him. Now, some want to translate this literally, that she actually is going to get up, and as we're going to see, she goes about the town. Or is this a dream? I think most scholars would agree that this is a dream with some very symbolic meanings. She had some anxieties about the wedding, which I think most brides would have, the excitement as well, but also some doubt, so to speak. But God had given those desires to her. They were committed, both Solomon and the Shulamite woman were committed to a godly marriage. In verse 2, she says, in this dream, she's thinking, I will arise and go about the city through the streets and plazas. I will seek the one I love. It said, I sought him, but I did not find him. Well, all of a sudden, this dream turns into a nightmare. She cannot find the one she loves. Now, the first thing that tells us this is probably a dream. It would not be practical that she was walking along at night because all kinds of things could happen to her, of course, and that would not be the place you would probably meet the king in that night. But the symbolic gesture here in the book of Proverbs, as we've just finished studying, talks about wisdom and a prostitute both roam the streets. And so wisdom is personified by the woman here, brings life and favor from God, but sexual immorality leads to death. And so that's what this is saying. We're still being very cautious about our dating and what we're going to do. So it says, though, that she was willing to risk in this dream the dangers of the nighttime, but she felt so compelled that this was the relationship with the groom was so important and so God-given that she wanted to pursue this in the dream. And then in verse 3 it says, the guards who go about the city found me. It says, I asked them, have you seen the one I love? Well, as she's traveling in the dream, she sees the guards. Now, what was the guards' responsibility in Jerusalem or in a major city? They were, of course, to stay on the wall. They were to warn of enemies' attacks on the outside, those trying to get in. But also they would alert the citizens of the danger of internal threats. So these guards represent some safeguards that we have in our lives. It does reveal the intensity of her love. It showed that she loved him enough to remember to ask the guards, to ask questions. Now, as we're thinking about a relationship or any decision in life, is it not important to ask questions? Is it not important maybe to get the input of other people? And certainly she did this. She wanted to know as much as she could about her husband, and her husband to be would want to know as much as he could about her. You know, we can never know too much about the loved one that we're about to marry. There's no way that we could ever substitute the information that we might have. And then it says in verse 4, it said, I had just passed them. She'd just passed the guards when I found the one I love. So she found Solomon. It says she held on to him and would not let him go until I brought him to my mother's house, to the chamber of the one who conceived me. Now she found him, and notice, where did she take him? It says she took him to her mother's house, a place of security, a place where she grew up. In many ways, she is still a young girl. We know that she's about 15, as I said earlier, so she still has a lot of growing to do, but her mother had taught her about life in those years prior to this, and so she took him to a safe place, and she's again practicing sexual restraint. And then here in verse 5, it says she's speaking to the young women of Jerusalem. Young women of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and the wild ones of the field, do not stir up or awaken love until the appropriate time. Now, 3 times in the book of Solomon, a Song of Solomon, the daughter of Jerusalem's give these charges: do not stir up or awaken love until the appropriate time. What does that mean? The true love is worthy to be called love. There's a tendency sometimes, and many times in our society, and particularly among young people, teenagers, and it could be any age, of course, to fall victim to puppy love. We've heard that term, or infatuation for true love. Now, Paul helps us distinguish all of these things from that God has given us the capacity to control our physical desires. You know, all the animals of the world do not have this capacity, but as humans, we do. And it says the Holy Spirit also enables us to listen and to obey the safeguards with His Word. That's why it's so important that we hide His Word in our hearts. He closes this section with saying, let love sleep until it is time to be awakened. As Christian couples, we need to honor this part in having the right relationship with God. Both the Old Testament and the New Testament says that the relationship with God is an example of His covenant people and the relationship with Himself as well. Now, today we live in a society that doesn't necessarily believe what we've just shared with you today. The majority of people favor living together as a tryout for marriage. Many believe that sex is for fun and to have no strings attached. And it's an economical issue as well. But you know what God says in the Bible is different than what the world believes. And you know, we may change our minds as human beings, but God never changes His mind, does He, in this regard? God's is consistent. He's always there. Many of these young people who pursue these other ways of living, it's interesting to note some of the surveys that they hope one day to meet and marry someone who fulfills their emotional and spiritual needs. Wow, that's quite a statement, isn't it? That even after all of these things that perhaps they go through, they will still want to come back. You know, God opens the door for us to come back when we step out of line. Certainly there are consequences to pay for decisions that we make are not right. There are many severe consequences that can take place, but God's always open and ready for us to come back. Well, I hope these few little verses today have helped us. Next week we're going to begin to look at the marriage itself and then the challenges that we'll face in our married life. Until we meet then, though, God bless you and have a wonderful day.